Throughout wrestling history, there have been many legendary wrestling families, from the Harts and the Guerreros to the Von Erichs and even the McMahons themselves. One family that is often overlooked is the Wyndham family, which includes patriarch Robert DeRoy Wyndham, aka Blackjack Mulligan, his sons Barry and Kendall, his stepson Mike IRS Rotunda, and his maternal grandchildren Wyndham Bray Wyatt Rotunda and Taylor Rotunda, who wrestled as Bo Dallas. Born and bred in the Lone Star State, the Wyndham boys all have reputations for being great workers in the ring, but for father-son duo Robert and Kendall, their careers threatened to be overshadowed and their lives turned upside down when they got involved in some unsavory business in the late 1980s. Just what were Blackjack Mulligan and his youngest doing with $1 million in counterfeit money? How did they get caught? And what happened to them once the police and FBI zeroed in? Robert DeRoy Wyndham was born in Sweetwater, Texas on November 25, 1942 and grew up in nearby Odessa. A mountain of a man standing around 6 foot 7 inches tall and weighing over 300 pounds, Wyndham looked to have a promising football career ahead of him and received tryouts with the New Orleans Saints and Denver Broncos. His football dream ended though when he suffered a bad compound fracture in his left leg, and so Wyndham, at the urging of local sports hero Wahoo McDaniel, who juggled football and wrestling, decided to get into wrestling and transformed into Blackjack Mulligan, a rugged cowboy type who used the feared Iron Claw as a finisher. He debuted in 1967, the same year his second son Kendall was born, following Barry, who arrived in 1960. Well respected within the industry for his toughness and character, Mulligan enjoyed a very successful career over the course of 2 decades that saw him work for just about every territory going, as well as in Japan and for WWE, which is where he finished up his full-time in-ring career in 1987. Not afraid to stand up to anyone outside of the ring, even Andre the Giant, Mulligan drew incredible amounts of heat, and once, following a match with Pedro Morales in Boston, was stabbed in the leg with a knife that had been dipped in pig fat, thus infecting the wound. His Blackjacks tag team alongside Blackjack Lanza is considered one of the best of theirs, or in fact any era. Looking to emulate his dad, Kendall Wyndham got into the business in 1984. Though not as athletically gifted or talented as his old brother Barry, Kendall had no issues finding work. But while he was a rookie trying to make a name for himself in championship wrestling from Florida, his brother and brother-in-law were enjoying fame as a tag team that would land them on the card at WrestleMania. Kendall would never quite reach the heights of his more famous family members. Meanwhile, with one eye on retirement, Blackjack Mulligan had invested heavily in real estate in his later wrestling years, and doing so had seemingly paid off. He did not make these investments alone, however, and was in business with what he described as 4 or 5 attorneys in Florida. Mulligan claimed that the value of the properties he had a stake in, including a shopping center, was around $35 million. While this might sound like a decent nest egg for when his bone-bending days were over, the reality of the situation was far different, and the investments appeared to not be as shrewd as he would have liked to believe. US President Ronald Reagan turned the real estate world on its head with the Tax Reform Act of 1986. Essentially, the properties that Blackjack had invested in just a couple of years prior were no longer tax deductible, and he was left holding the bag. Caught in a bind and feeling as though the wolves were circling, Mulligan made a few bad decisions. He got involved in a large counterfeiting scheme after originally being approached by, of all people, Mark B. Arrington, who, as Patrick St. Michael, performed as the lead singer of Florida-based glam metal band Entice. Arrington had initially asked Kendall to find someone to help him take the dodgy cash, which had been buried in his backyard. Kendall called his father, who, rather than telling his son to stay out of such illegal matters, put a call in to a friend. That friend, in turn, called the authorities, setting the stage for the phony deal that would see both Wyndhams arrested. Blackjack agreed to meet with some people who, at the time, he didn't know were undercover Secret Service agents in Brandon, Florida on December 22nd, 1989. He sold them $1,020 worth of bogus $20 bills and planned to meet up with them later, where he would sell them substantially more fake money. At the second meeting, Blackjack arrived with 2 suitcases that were full of nearly $1 million worth of fake $20 bills and offered to sell them to the undercover agents for $250,000 of real money. Kendall arrived in a separate car, and as they and another unnamed man tried to close the deal, they were arrested. The Secret Service, who did the investigation jointly with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, later called the seizure one of the largest single seizures of counterfeit money in US history. They further added that the money was originally intended as payment in a drug deal that never occurred. Rather than trying to brawl their way out of the situation, the Wyndhams decided to cooperate with the investigators and helped them wrangle the rest of the people who were in on the conspiracy. With the help of Blackjack and Kendall, investigators were able to identify and charge 7 other men, including Arrington, for their part in the scheme. The 9-person ring had been under investigation since April. Though they helped put others behind bars, something that Blackjack later contested, saying that he never gave anyone up while pointing out that he got a harsher sentence, something not typically done to informants, he wasn't off the hook, and he and his son would have to face the music in front of a judge. Their defense attorney, Claudia J. Wheeler, made the case for leniency, pointing out that they had fully cooperated with investigators without contacting an attorney and were arrested before a noteworthy amount of money actually changed hands. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jay Hoffer agreed that they initially cooperated, but that they later hedged in their cooperation and gave some questionable answers while undergoing a polygraph test. Wheeler subsequently mentioned that the Secret Service were trying to ascertain whether Barry was involved in the operation in some way too. Barry was never implicated, but his father was asked repeatedly whether his eldest had received any of the money. Wheeler further stated that there was no evidence that Barry knew what his family were up to and that none of the counterfeit cash was passed into the general economy, though other reports state that some of it did make its way into the economy before being recovered. Incidentally, it was Barry who paid the $25,000 bail to get his father and brother out of jail. As a consequence of their arrest and conviction, Barry decided to quit WWE, where he was wrestling as the Widowmaker at the time. In March of 1990, Robert Wyndham pleaded guilty to attempted passing of counterfeit money and received 2 years in a minimum security prison, followed by 2 years of probation. Speaking after being sentenced, he said, "I made a very serious, stupid decision, and I apologize to the government and my family, and especially to the children, to whom I am a role model. I surely am wiser now, and I feel very responsible for my young son." The following month, Kendall also pled guilty and received a sentence of 27 months, followed by 2 years of probation. His sentence was higher because he had a previous arrest for battery. Kendall said, "I can't stand here and deny what I did, but I would like to repay society." The judge allowed both men to remain free until the Bureau of Prisons determined where they would serve their sentence. Once released, Blackjack described where he was as not strictly a prison, but more like a camp, noting that it wasn't easy, but that it was a good mental thing for him. After prison, it was a bit of a rough ride for Blackjack and Kendall. They initially worked for Eddie Mansfield's IWF promotion in Florida, often in front of less than 200 paying fans. It was quite the fall from grace for Mulligan especially. He had been a huge star in decades gone by, and now here he was in his 50s, physically suffering from his years on the road and with his reputation temporarily in tatters due to his conviction. He eventually got a job as a color commentator for WCW, but the job didn't last. He wrestled his last match at the 1993 Slamboree pay-per-view, competing in a 6-man Legends match alongside old road buddies like Dick Murdoch, Don Morocco, and Superfly Jimmy Snuka. He stayed with WCW in a backstage capacity for a few years and even helped at the power plant training facility before calling it a day. Blackjack then got into the used car business, opening up a small lot with his wife before retiring to the ranch. Kendall, meanwhile, steadily rebuilt his career, first overseas for All Japan and then in WCW, where he was a member of the West Texas Rednecks and won the tag team titles with his brother Barry. He retired in 2002. Incredibly, after his bumping days were done, he started up his own security firm. As for his father, he was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2006 alongside Blackjack Lanza. Reflecting on his run-in with the law and time spent in prison years later, Mulligan, a devout Christian, was able to joke about it, telling people he went to Florida on vacation and ended up on probation. He was repentant too, however, and realized that he had done something wrong, feeling especially bad about getting his sons mixed up in it. Thankfully, the Wyndhams served their penance and didn't fall back into the shady underworld. Blackjack Mulligan, remembered as one of the wrestling industry's greats whose criminal record was but a footnote in the end, passed away on April 7th, 2016.